Good morning. Still morning, yes. I'm so confused. I don't know what day it is. We've been here all week, so. Well, last night I was having real nightmares because I felt that I was going to be letting everyone down as I didn't have a perfect solution to the small business taxation problem. Having heard the talks this morning, I feel a lot better. And suspect that that was a slightly female reaction. Yes, so I am now going to say that I'm rejecting that reaction, and I think that the problem is that the men have made a mess, and I don't see why the women should have to solve it. So, what I'm going to do is talk about what is a small business. And I'm going to explain that, in my view, the small businesses are at the heart of the problem of corporation tax. When Malcolm Gammy kindly asked me to be involved in the Mirrlees review, I think everybody thought that small businesses were a bit of an afterthought. It was going to be a special topic. It wasn't really part of the central problem. And very soon it became clear that was not the case. Corporation tax has to be designed around small businesses, and therefore I come at this in a very different direction from Mike Devereaux, who clearly starts with large businesses, and this brings me to John Snape's earlier comment. Don't worry, we have that discussion quite often here about law and economics, and we have drunk a great deal of coffee in the cause of trying to discuss this. There is a real dynamic. Mike has the vision, and I say, but what about national insurance? So we are aware of that tension. I'm going to talk about UK corporation tax and the small business experience, a little bit of historical background, although Peter has covered some of that, and John Avery Jones, and then try to think about the way we should be thinking about small business taxation as we think about the future. But since we haven't really worked out how we want to think about the future, it's not so easy to say how we're going to fit small business taxation into that. So, thing that everyone always thinks about when they talk about small businesses is the little corner shop. So I thought I'd have a little corner shop here. But actually, small business means very different things to different people, and that's one of the problems. So we might be talking about owner-managed businesses, or we might be talking about closely controlled businesses, which is not necessarily identical, private rather than publicly owned. We might be talking about size, and that can be defined in so many different ways and is defined in many different ways within our system. And the definition has to depend on the purpose for the definition. So we start with the problem that we may all be talking about a different thing. We may not, in fact, be talking about the small business, the small corner shop. Some people are talking about the small entrepreneur. Some people are talking about the lifestyle business. Actually, if you wanted to have a tax system that suited all of them, you would have to have about 20 different tax systems. So the idea that there are large businesses and then there are small businesses and that you could have two different systems seems to me to be massively oversimplistic. Within the UK, as in most other countries, there are many different ways of doing business, as most people here know, and I've listed them here because we've been having discussions this week with many overseas visitors, and I thought I would just set out what we do have here, in particular what we have by way of pass-through entities. So we do have a pass-through entity, the LLP. Obviously, also unincorporated firms are pass-through. But the LLP has limited liability. The take-up for this has been very low for reasons I'll explain. And obviously then we have owner-managed limited companies, and our limited companies are not the same as LLCs. So when I talk about a limited company, I talk about an incorporated firm. through closely controlled, through the whole spectrum, via private equity to the largest publicly owned companies. And that's a spectrum, and there are not clear cut-off points. And that is one of our problems. And I think, although it would be nice to say that you could go for neutral treatment right the way through that spectrum, it's pretty clear that at each end of the spectrum, from employees to the largest company, you are not going to be able to treat everybody the same. There are going to be different legal rights and duties, and though they're often seen as form rather than substance, they are not just form, they do make a difference. Legal rights and duties do make a difference, and there are practical differences. So we could go one of two ways. We could either say, let's align this as far as possible so that we don't have too many jumps, too many shocks, too many discontinuities, only the ones we really have to have. So we could go for alignment on the one hand, or we could accept that there are differences and ask, is there any reason at all, as I think Mike has asked, why income tax and corporation tax should be aligned and integrated in the modern global economy. If we are going to accept differences, we have to think about where we're going to draw the lines. So, as I say, small businesses are at the heart of the matter. And although when we think about corporation law and corporation economics, we think of the corporation as an entity in which you are separating out ownership and management. The small business clearly does not fit well into that theoretical structure, into the nexus of contracts and principal agency theory of the firm. You know, really these small firms shouldn't be incorporating at all in the ideal world of the economist. They don't fit, but they do incorporate. They always have incorporated, and this is where the political economy comes in. If you tried to say they should not be allowed to incorporate, you would definitely have a riot on your hands. There is almost in the UK a feeling of a fundamental right to incorporate, and people would be crosser about that than the Human Rights Act. So we are always going to have small businesses incorporating. Even one-person businesses will incorporate. That was established a long time ago in the case of Salomon & Salomon. It's not going to change. And the key differences I think what we need to do is work out what are the key differences we're trying to do, and we've already discussed these or come across these in our discussions this morning. The big question is that incorporation allows the business owner to mix labour income with income on capital and disguise labour income as income on capital. And that not only raises the question of whether we should be having differential tax rates on those two forms of income, but also the question of social security payments, national insurance payments, which have in our system for a long time been linked to employment and work and labour, and how are we going to fit that into this system. So we can't ignore that question, and we can't design corporation tax with small businesses as an afterthought. And I think that the government, I'm sure the government is only too well aware of that problem, and I've got a quote here from David Gauke when he spoke on the 1st of June this year at a conference which Mike also organised, where he talked about the reasons for having to have a corporation tax, for the continued existence of a corporation tax, and he gave the usual reasons. But he also said something which to me was very interesting, and I wonder if this is something that's being thought about inside government. To go below a 20% rate of corporation tax may require us to address some of the structural issues in our system. And that was very interesting because he didn't say we're not going to go below 20%. He just says there are some structural problems in going below 20%, and those structural problems are, of course, the questions of integration and small businesses. So what did they think about this in 1965 when they were introducing the corporation tax, which, as Peter Harris has said, was really not so much of a discontinuity as it sounds? Even before the corporation tax was introduced, since 1922, there had been anti-avoidance provisions to deal with the problem of corporations not distributing their income within a reasonable time. Like Peter, I'm referring you to this excellent historical article in the British Tax Review by Stopforth and Goodacre, which is really fascinating on the history. The close company provisions for companies controlled by 5 or fewer participators, quite a complicated definition, were tightened in 1965, and apportionment, which John Avery Jones referred to, was introduced. I also remember being in meetings about apportionment, I am sorry to say, although I wasn't in them in 1965. But this was not abolished until 1989. And the company was deemed to have distributed up to 60% of its net trading profits, except to the extent that it could show retained profits were needed for the business. Now, John has already explained what a difficult, complex and manipulable concept that was. I think when it was abolished in 1989, notionally, because income tax and capital gains tax had been harmonized at that point, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. It was really not working well. However, I don't want to put ideas into anybody's heads again either, but I can see that being something that we might have to look at again if we don't go for any more radical reforms, because we no longer have harmonization of capital gains tax and income tax, and we have the big difference that Peter Harris pointed out between corporation tax and the top rates of income tax. So I wouldn't be wholly surprised if it was being looked at again, although it is very, very difficult to implement. And I definitely don't think it will be a simplification if it is implemented. The other problem, which recurs all the time with small business taxation, is that of one-person companies, personal service companies. And it was really fascinating to read the Stopforth article, because he explained that the Inland Revenue in 1965 were particularly concerned about public entertainers using corporations. We now have this debate recurring with the BBC. But the draftsman was in a hurry in 1965, so he left the bit about that out of the Act. And we now have the personal service companies legislation introduced in 2000, which is referred to here for reasons I won't go into as IR35. And it treats corporate income as equivalent to employment income in some circumstances, but is very uncertain in its application. It has very limited success for HMRC and was criticised roundly in a House of Lords report in 2014. The government estimated in its response to the House of Lords that the cost of abolition of IR35 would be £550 million. If that's right, why bother? I know that sounds like a lot of money, but the cost has not been written into that, and there are great compliance costs, I think, with IR35. But it does show that a problem that was anticipated in 1965 is still here. We haven't solved it. Integration of tax and national insurance would not solve it, but would certainly help a great deal. And the Office of Tax Simplification has repeatedly suggested that that would be the way to go. I don't know whether you can see these figures, and I'm not really meaning to go through them all, but I thought that I should discuss one little blip in the history of our corporation tax, which was the introduction of, first of all, a 10% rate for companies with small profits up to £10,000 a year, and then that was turned into a nil rate for a short time. And surprise, surprise, lots of people incorporated. And that was quickly abolished in 2006, and as we saw in the David Gauke quote earlier, the HMRC was apparently surprised to find that people were incorporating for tax reasons. The rate schedule, as you can see, has in the past had a small profits rate. We now no longer need that small profits rate because of alignment, although it seemed to me that abolishing the legislation for the small profits rate was quite brave, given the way governments play around with tax rates. But it's out of the legislation now. And some of you will have seen this chart before, but here I explain on this chart the different ways we tax employees, or self-employed, and owner-managers. And we can see why national insurance is very important in this picture, because one reason why one might incorporate is so that the owner can pay himself and members of his family. He can split his income between members of the family, and he can pay out dividends rather than wages, and therefore not have to pay as much national insurance. So this creates significant distortion. There is a significant saving by incorporating, and we can see the changes, the cumulative change of the number of businesses between 1996 and 2009, and the green line is companies soaring ahead but levelling out when the law was changed, although it's still beneficial to be incorporated in the UK and to pay corporate tax and then be able to extract the profits in the way that I've just described. So that will not have levelled off completely at all. So do we have pass-through entities? Well, as I've explained, we don't really need them in that for tax reasons. People are not going to use them. LLPs were introduced in 2000, came into effect in 2001, but they were not designed for small firms, and they have not been very much used by small firms, and there is absolutely no tax incentive to use them unless you're engaging in certain tax avoidance schemes. And again, surprise, surprise, they're being used in tax avoidance schemes. What a surprise. Because they give limited liability. I think this too was predicted, but not predicted quite carefully enough. So we've had to have amendments to the legislation. In 2014, there were 1.5 million actively trading limited companies, 3.3 million sole traders, but only 56,000 LLPs. So as you can see, the take-up has been very small. So moving on and trying to rethink what we do about this. I think there are some really big problems. The biggest problem is definitional. The problems are about boundaries. Any time you create a boundary, you're going to create tax avoidance opportunities and you're going to create compliance costs. So you have to be very careful about inserting boundaries unless you really think they're going to be helpful. So the corporations as we know them in the UK are clearly being used as a tax shelter from income tax. I have to say our solutions are going to have to depend on what we do more generally as well, because this is at the crux of the relationship between personal tax, family tax, and corporation tax. So looking at this in any way other than holistically is really not going to work. But I shall try to focus just on small businesses. So we could say, well, we should, as in the US, have a higher rate of corporation tax than income tax, and then no one would want to incorporate. That would be good, wouldn't it? Obviously, this goes quite contrary to the trend at the moment. It would be non-competitive, it would discourage investment, it would be contrary to current trends. And if we did that, then I think we'd see taxpayers all trying to set up LLPs, so they would try to get around that. And there is some notion in the UK that the pass-through in the USA is an incredible success, but all the mutterings that I have heard from the Joint Committee on Congress, from people I've heard speaking at conferences, is that it's not quite so successful in the USA as some people would like to believe. And there was an interesting article in Tax Analysts hinting at that based on a leaked report from the Joint Committee on Taxation, to which Lou and I actually contributed. So we could try to do that, but I'm not sure that that would be helpful. We could try to align all rates of tax and have a flat rate for income tax, which was the same as the corporation tax rate. This looks pretty unlikely to happen as well, unlikely to be acceptable. Whether we like it or not, there are different rates for around the world for income from labour and income on capital. It is seen to be necessary because of globalisation, and I think it's unlikely that we are going to be able to do anything like that. One of the things that Mike and I have been discussing over these many coffees is whether there should be pass-through, and if voluntary pass-through is not going to work, and clearly it wouldn't in the current circumstances because no one would choose it, could you have mandatory pass-through for small companies? So could you say to these small companies, don't mess up our international tax system, you have to be treated on a pass-through basis? I simply can't think how you would decide who is in mandatory pass-through and who was not. A size definition would be very easy to manipulate. A qualitative definition is hard to embody in legislation. If you give no choice, then that may be fine for some small lifestyle businesses and so on, but how are you going to ab initio, from the beginning, distinguish between those lifestyle businesses which have no desire to grow and the businesses which are small at the moment but which do want to grow, and where there is a sense, whether rightly or wrongly, that we want to encourage businesses like that to invest in their company, and that was the reason for the nil rate. It was the reason for those funny rules about apportionment. It's not going to be acceptable that certain small businesses can't shelter their income at all if they're trying to save up for that factory, whereas the large business can shelter its income when it wants to build a company. That does not produce a level playing field. So I have yet to be convinced that that's going to work. It would deal with the sheltering problem to some extent. It still doesn't deal with the social security problem, the problem that you can convert your labour income into dividends. Another possibility, the final possibility, of course, is to go back to the apportionment provisions, and I've already talked about those. They could achieve similar results to the mandatory pass-through, but allow for some retention, but I think it would be fiendishly complicated. So I come to the proposals in the Mirrlees review, which were based on some work that Claire Crawford at the IFS and I did in 2010. Now, this has to be understood in the context of the Mirrlees review as a whole. So people have said, well, how could you implement this tomorrow? And we couldn't, because we have to look at how this fits in to the world, the tax world as a whole, but we were writing it within a context. And the proposal there was going to fit in with a world where there wouldn't be tax on normal returns on capital. So for our small business, we would exempt the normal rate of return, that's a notional rate of return, on capital at the corporate level through an allowance for corporate equity, an ACE, and at the shareholder level through a rate of return allowance. So there would be no tax on the normal return on equity. But since many of these small businesses have no equity, they would not really be affected at all by that. And then you would tax above the normal returns to capital and labour income at the same rate, including national insurance, so you would cover that off. You would integrate tax and national insurance. We've done that in our world. It's very easy in our world. And we could add progressivity if desired for domestic shareholders. So in this sense, it's different from the Nordic dual rate system because we accept that you might want to add some more tax on top. And in that way, you are taxing capital at a lower effective rate. So the corporation tax rate for the rest of it can be higher without being uncompetitive or discouraging real investment. And the real beauty of this is it's self-regulating. You don't have to have a definition in the legislation because you're basing it on your definition of the capital base in the company. But that's, of course, the problem, which I'll come to. But in theory anyway, one-person companies with no investment would be taxed at the same rate as employees with no need for any arbitrary definitions. It would be completely self-regulating. Now, that's a little bit based on the Nordic dual income tax system, but has been adapted. And the big difficulty is the one that is very well known to those who've looked at that Nordic system, which is very difficult to define the capital base and especially to work out how to deal with goodwill, internally generated goodwill. It doesn't solve the income splitting problem, and it only works in a Mirrlees world. But it seems to me that it's a useful thought experiment, and it was interesting this week to hear Ed Kleinbart talk about his ideas and the centrifuge, which splits out labour and labour income from income on capital. Somehow we have to find a way of splitting them off, treating them differently, without having arbitrary definitions. And if someone can do that, then that will be a prize winner. I don't say that we've done that with the Mirrlees proposal, but I think it's an interesting thought experiment. So, to conclude, ultimately, I think we need to make some bigger decisions before we can decide on what we're doing about small businesses, and we do need to decide whether where we are prepared to break the continuum along the spectrum that I've talked about. But the large-small distinction, whilst when we're talking theoretically seems very obvious, it seems very obvious that we should be treating large public companies differently from small businesses, it is not so easy when you actually come to try to put it into practice, and that's where the world of the lawyer clashes with the world of the economist, and that's why Mike and I have got a lot more coffee to drink. But some kind of self-regulating splitting out seems to me to be what we should aspire to, and I certainly think that ideas of introducing a pass-through approach in the UK should be approached with much caution.